The real story of Doc Holliday is far darker than the legends ever admitted. Behind the sharp smile and fearless reputation was a dying man haunted by pain, violence, and the constant shadow of death. Diagnosed with tuberculosis while still young, Holliday knew every breath could be his last, and that terrifying reality transformed him into one of the most dangerous men in the Wild West. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and walked into gunfights with the cold calm of someone who no longer feared dying. But what truly sends chills down the spine is how intelligent and refined he once was. A trained dentist with manners of Southern gentleman, slowly consumed by illness and bloodshed until he became a feared outlaw whose name terrified entire towns. His friendship with Wyatt Earp only deepened the mystery surrounding him, especially after the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, where witnesses claimed Holliday looked eerily calm while bullets flew around him. In the end, the fearless gunfighter didn't die in a blaze of glory, but alone in a bed, staring at his bare feet in disbelief. Because after surviving countless shootouts, he never imagined death would come quietly instead with a gun in his hand. People across the American frontier whispered the name Doc Holliday with a mixture of fear and fascination, but very few truly understood the nightmare he lived every single day. Long before he became one of the deadliest gunmen in the Wild West, Holliday was known as John Henry Holliday, a well-educated Southern man born into a respectable family that expected greatness from him. He studied hard, became a dentist, and carried himself with intelligence and charm that impressed nearly everyone he met. No one could have predicted that this polished young professional would eventually become a symbol of violence and death. But fate had something cruel waiting for him. When doctors informed him that he had tuberculosis, the same disease that had already taken members of his family, his entire world shattered overnight. In those years, tuberculosis was practically a death sentence. Victims wasted away slowly, coughing blood, while their bodies grew weaker month after month. Holliday suddenly understood that his future had been stolen from him before it had even begun. That diagnosis changed something deep inside him. Friends claimed his personality slowly darkened after learning he was dying. The polite dentist who once dreamed of success and stability began drifting toward gambling halls, saloons, and dangerous frontier towns where men settled arguments with bullets instead of words. Many historians believe Holliday stopped caring about consequences because he believed death was already following him everywhere he went. When a man no longer fears dying, he becomes unpredictable and terrifying. That was exactly what happened to Doc Holliday. He developed a deadly reputation not because he was the biggest or strongest man in the room, but because he possessed something far more dangerous. Complete indifference toward his own survival, in smoky gambling halls filled with criminals, outlaws, drifters, and hired killers, Holliday became known for his razor-sharp temper. Witnesses described him as intelligent but explosive, capable of laughing one moment and reaching for a pistol the next. His constant coughing fits only made him more unsettling. People claimed they could hear him coughing blood into handkerchiefs moments before calmly returning to a poker game as if nothing had happened. Some even believe his illness made him emotionally numb, turning him into a man who viewed violence as ordinary. Rumors spread from town to town about deadly confrontations involving Holliday. Some stories were exaggerated, while others were horrifyingly real. One thing that made Doc Holliday so unusual was a contradiction within him. He looked nothing like the brutal killers roaming the frontier. He was thin, pale, educated, and often dressed with surprising elegance. Yet behind that civilized appearance was a man who had no hesitation pulling a trigger if threatened. People who underestimated him often regretted it. Frontier towns were full of loud, drunken men trying to prove themselves, and many thought the sickly gambler would be an easy target. Instead, they discovered someone frighteningly fast with both his hands and his mind. The friendship between Holliday and Wyatt Earp became one of the most legendary alliances in American history, though it was also surrounded by suspicion and mystery. The two men could not have seemed more different on the surface. Earp was a lawman obsessed with control and reputation, while Holliday was reckless and self-destructive. Yet they trusted each other completely. Some historians believe Wyatt Earp saw something in Holliday that few others did: loyalty. Despite his violent reputation, Doc repeatedly risked his life to protect Earp. That loyalty became especially important in the lawless town of Tombstone, where tensions between the Earp brothers and the outlaw Cowboys gang were spiraling toward disaster. The infamous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted less than a minute, but it transformed Holliday into a dark legend forever. Witnesses described pure chaos as gunfire exploded through the dusty street. Smoke filled the air while terrified bystanders ran for cover. Some accounts claim Holliday carried a shotgun during the battle, making him even deadlier at close range. Several men fell bleeding into the dirt as bullets tore through the narrow alleyway. But what disturbed people most was the eerie calm Holliday reportedly displayed during the violence. Survivors later claimed he looked almost emotionless, as though death had become completely ordinary to him. After the gunfight, tensions in Tombstone exploded even further. Revenge killings, ambushes, and threats consumed the town. The Earps and Holliday became targets, and bloodshed followed wherever they went. During the violent events known as the Earp Vendetta Ride, multiple men connected to the Cowboys gang were hunted down and killed. Historians still debate exactly how many deaths Holliday was responsible for, but there is little doubt that his reputation as a deadly gunfighter grew larger with every passing month. Newspapers portrayed him as either a heroic defender or a cold-blooded murderer, depending on who was telling the story. Yet beneath all the gun smoke and outlaw mythology was a man physically falling apart. Tuberculosis never stopped destroying him. Friends noticed that his coughing fits became more violent over time. He drank heavily, partly to numb the pain and partly because alcohol temporarily eased the symptoms. Gambling became both an addiction and a survival tool. In frontier towns, a skilled gambler could earn money quickly, but gambling halls were also dangerous places filled with armed men, cheaters, and criminals. Holliday existed in that deadly world because he no longer fit anywhere else as years passed. The once feared gunfighter became increasingly fragile. The image of the unstoppable killer began fading into something tragic. Witnesses described him as gaunt and exhausted, sometimes barely able to stand without coughing uncontrollably. Yet even in that weakened condition, people remained afraid of him. His reputation alone was enough to silence entire rooms. Men who had heard the stories about Tombstone knew better than to provoke him. The strange thing was that Holliday himself reportedly seemed amused by his own legend. Some accounts suggest he mocked the exaggerated stories, while others claim he quietly enjoyed the fear his name created. One of the most chilling aspects of Doc Holliday's life was his apparent acceptance of death. Unlike most men, he did not spend his final years desperately trying to avoid danger. He continued gambling, drinking, and confronting armed enemies even while his health collapsed. Friends later admitted they believed Holliday expected to die violently at any moment. In many ways, he seemed prepared for it. Every gunfight, every argument, and every dangerous encounter felt like another step toward the inevitable. But fate had one final surprise waiting for him in 1887. Holliday arrived in Glenwood Springs, hoping the hot springs might ease the suffering caused by tuberculosis. By then, he was extremely weak. The once dangerous gunfighter who had survived countless confrontations could barely fight the disease destroying his lungs. Those around him watched the legendary outlaw slowly fade away inside a hotel room. There were no dramatic shootouts, no final duels in the street, and no enemies waiting outside his door. Instead, there was silence. According to one famous story, Holliday looked down at his bare feet shortly before dying and laughed quietly to himself. For years, he had believed he would die with boots on during some violent gunfight. Instead, death arrived peacefully in bed. The irony stunned him. Moments later, the feared gunman was gone forever at only 36 years old. Even after his death, the mystery surrounding Doc Holliday continued growing. Some viewed him as a loyal friend trapped by illness and circumstance. Others saw him as a dangerous killer who embraced violence too easily. Hollywood later transformed him into a near-mythical figure. But the real man was far more disturbing because he was real. He was not simply a fearless outlaw from old Western stories. He was a dying man who walked through life with nothing left to lose, and that made him one of the most terrifying figures the Wild West had ever seen. The truth about Doc Holliday continues to fascinate people because his story feels larger than life, yet painfully human at the same time. Beneath the guns, saloons, and legendary duels was a man battling fear, illness, anger, and loneliness. Every cough reminded him death was getting closer. Every gunfight was another gamble against fate. And perhaps that is what truly gives people chills even today. The realization that some of the most feared legends in history were not fearless at all. They were simply men who had already lost everything as the years passed. The legend of Doc Holliday began spreading far beyond dusty frontier towns. Stories about him traveled through saloons, newspapers, train stations, and gambling halls across America. Some people claimed he had killed dozens of men. Others insisted he was nothing more than a sick gambler whose reputation had grown out of control. The truth was buried somewhere between myth and reality. But one thing remained certain. Wherever Holliday went, fear followed close behind. Part of what made him so terrified was the unpredictability surrounding him. Many gunfighters in the Old West acted tough for attention, but Doc Holliday carried himself differently. Witnesses often described him as unusually quiet before violence erupted. There were moments when he appeared almost detached from the chaos around him, as though he had already accepted whatever outcome awaited him. That calmness unnerved people more than shouting or threats ever could. In frontier towns where survival depended on reading dangerous men correctly, Holliday was nearly impossible to read. Several accounts from those who encountered him paint a chilling picture. One gambler reportedly recalled watching Holliday sit through an entire poker game while barely speaking a word, coughing blood into a cloth every few minutes. The room was tense because everyone knew he was armed, dangerous, and extremely ill. Then, after another player accused someone of cheating, Holliday slowly looked up with ice-cold eyes and placed his hand near his pistol. According to the story, the entire room fell silent instantly. No one moved. No one breathed. That was the effect Doc Holliday had on people. Yet, despite his violent reputation, there were moments when another side of him appeared unexpectedly. Friends sometimes described him as intelligent, witty, and strangely loyal. He could speak with the manners of a Southern gentleman one moment and threaten someone with deadly seriousness the next. This contradiction confused even those closest to him. Was he truly a ruthless killer, or was he simply a broken man shaped by pain and desperation? Historians still argue over that question today. His friendship with Wyatt Earp remained one of the strongest bonds in his life, but it also carried enormous consequences. Many believe Holliday's loyalty to Earp dragged him deeper into violence than he otherwise might have gone. During the years after the gunfight at the OK Corral, enemies surrounded them from every direction. Threats became constant. Ambushes became common. Men connected to outlaw groups wanted revenge, and Holliday stood directly beside the Earps through all of it. One particularly chilling story claimed Holliday once warned a man never to draw a weapon against him unless he intended to use it immediately. The warning sounded simple, but those who heard it later realized it reflected exactly how Holliday lived. He believed hesitation got people killed. Years of surviving dangerous confrontations had sharpened his instincts into something deadly. Unlike many outlaws who relied purely on intimidation, Holliday combined intelligence with speed and fearlessness. That combination made him extraordinarily dangerous. Still, the greatest enemy he ever faced was not another gunfighter. Tuberculosis continued eating away at him relentlessly. The disease caused exhaustion, fever, chest pain, and violent coughing fits that sometimes left blood staining his clothes. Imagine the horror of living every day knowing your own lungs were slowly destroying you from the inside. In the late 1800s, there was no cure. Doctors could offer little more than temporary relief. Holliday understood this better than anyone, and some historians believe that constant awareness of death shaped every reckless decision he made. There were nights when he reportedly drank until he could barely stand, trying to escape the pain for a few hours. Gambling halls became his second home because cards and alcohol distracted him from the reality waiting outside. But even there, death lingered nearby. Frontier gambling rooms were brutal places where arguments frequently turned deadly within seconds. Holliday survived because he adapted to that world completely. He became quicker, colder, and more willing to use violence before others could use it against him as his fame spread. Exaggerated stories transformed him into something almost supernatural. Some claimed he never lost his nerve. Others insisted he could outdraw nearly anyone alive. Whether true or not, those stories created an aura around him that terrified opponents before fights even began. Reputation was power in the Wild West, and Doc Holliday's reputation became enormous. But legends often hide ugly truths. Behind the famous gunfighter image was a deeply lonely man whose life had collapsed long before his death. Tuberculosis isolated him socially because many people feared the disease itself. Constant traveling prevented him from building stability anywhere. Gambling gave him temporary excitement but no lasting peace. Violence earned him respect but also endless enemies. In many ways, Holliday spent his final years wandering from town to town without any real sense of belonging. Even the American frontier itself was changing during his later years. Railroads expanded, law enforcement improved, and the chaotic Wild West slowly began disappearing. Men like Holliday belonged to a violent era that could not last forever. The romantic image later created by Hollywood ignored how grim and exhausting that lifestyle truly was. Gunfighters rarely lived long lives. Most ended up dead, imprisoned, or broken physically and emotionally by the time Holliday reached Glenwood Springs. He was barely recognizable compared to the feared gunman of Tombstone. Witnesses described him as shockingly thin, weak, and pale. Some days he could hardly leave his bed. The disease had finally won. Yet even then, there remained something haunting about him. Hotel workers and visitors reportedly stared in disbelief when they realized the dying man before them was the same Doc Holliday, whose name had terrified entire towns.